info@fadu.com.
This is Mubilu Musoke with another conversation on democratization of Africa. The case of Uganda in a comparative perspective. Those who have been following these conversations are now aware that we have been focusing on Canadian federalism. And last week we were analyzing and discussing the decision of the Supreme Court of Canada, which was a reference by the Governor in Council of Canada to the Supreme Court for an advisory opinion about the cessation, the legality of the cessation or attempted cessation by the province of Quebec. This decision, recalling from what we discussed last week, is a very important decision, both in understanding federalism and appreciating its relationship with democracy. The Supreme Court gave a very detailed judgment on these issues, how a province, in the case of Canada, or a federal state, in the case of any other federal system, can legally use a referendum to secede or cause a divorce between itself and the federal union. I think this is a very important decision because not only do we learn a lot about federalism, but also how federalism interacts with democracy. So we will continue briefly to go through this decision, to outline its rulings, and to see whether it can help us both to design a more effective federal system and democratization of the federal system in the process. The court pointed out that the conduct of the parties in such negotiations for secession, that is, would be governed by the same constitutional principles which give rise to the duty to negotiate, namely federalism, democracy, constitutionalism, and the rule of law, and the protection of minorities. As you may be aware, there is no state which has no minorities. And one of the functions of the constitutions and the human rights provisions in the constitutions is to protect minority rights. These principles lead us to, or led the court, the Supreme Court of Canada, to reject the two absolutist propositions. One of those propositions was that there would be a legal obligation on the other provinces and the federal government to accede to the cessation of a province, subject only to the negotiation of the logistical details of cessation. This proposition is attributed either to the supposed implications of the democratic principle of the Constitution or to the international principle of self-determination of peoples. For both theoretical and practical reasons, the Supreme Court could not accept this view. They held that Quebec could not purport to invoke a right to self-determination, such as to dictate the terms of a proposed cessation to the other parties. That would not be a negotiation at all, the court pointed out, as well as it would be naive to expect that the substantive goal of cessation could readily be distinguished from the practical details of cessation. The devil, as they say, would be in the details. The democracy principle, as we have the court pointed out, emphasized cannot be invoked to trump the principles of federalism and the rule of law, the rights of individuals and minorities, or the operation of democracy in other provinces in Canada as a whole. So no negotiations could be effective if their ultimate outcome, cessation, is cast as an absolute legal entitlement based upon an obligation to give effect to that act of cessation in the Constitution. Such a foregone conclusion would actually undermine the obligation to negotiate and render it hollow. So, however, the Supreme Court was equally unable to accept the reverse proposition that a clear expression of self-determination by the people of Quebec would impose no obligations upon the other provinces or the federal government. So the continued existence and the operation of Canadian constitutional order cannot remain indifferent to the clear expression of a clear majority of Quebecans that they no longer wish to remain in Canada. This would amount to the assertion that other constitutionally recognized principles necessarily trump the clearly expressed democratic will of the people of Quebec. Such a proposition fails to give sufficient weight to the underlying constitutional principles that must inform the amendment process, including the principles of democracy and federalism. The rights of other provinces and the federal government cannot deny the right of the government of Quebec to pursue cessation should a clear majority of the people of Quebec choose that goal, so long as in doing so, Quebec respects the rights of others. Negotiations would be necessary to address the interests of the federal government of Quebec and the other provinces and other participants, as well as the rights of all Canadians, both within and outside Quebec. Is the rejection of both of these propositions reconcilable? Yes, the Supreme Court answered. Once it is realized that none of the rights or principles under discussion is absolute to the exclusion of the others. This observation suggests that other parties cannot exercise their rights in such a way as to amount to an absolute denial of Quebec's rights. And similarly, that so long as Quebec exercises its rights while respecting the rights of others, it may propose secession and seek to achieve that secession through negotiation. The negotiation process precipitated by a decision of a clear majority of the population of Quebec on a clear question to pursue secession would require the reconciliation of various rights and obligations by the representatives of two legitimate majorities, namely the clear majority of the population of Quebec and the clear majority of Canada as a whole, whenever that may be. There can be no suggestion that either of these majorities trumps the other. A political majority that does not act in accordance with the underlying constitutional principles, the court held or identified, puts at risk the legitimacy of the exercise of its rights. So this ruling of the court, of course, brings us closer to the Swiss formula of federalism and direct democracy. If you may recall, the Swiss system has provisions in its constitution allowing the population to initiate, to bring forward initiatives and put them to a referendum and achieve particular goals. So this decision, in a sense, was not necessarily following the Swiss model or formula, but was elaborating on the process of democratization and federalism, which amounted to allowing the population, the people, to make a decision on important issues, including keeping the federal system together or even allowing cessation of a unity of the federal union. In such circumstances, the conduct of the parties assumes a primary constitutional significance. The negotiation process must be conducted with an eye to the constitutional principles which were outlined, which must conform to the actions of all the participants in the negotiation process. The refusal of a party to conduct negotiations in a manner consistent with the constitutional principles and values could seriously put at risk the legitimacy of that party's assertion of its rights and perhaps the negotiation process as a whole. Those who quite legitimately insist upon the importance of upholding the rule of law cannot at the same time be oblivious to the need to act in conformity with the constitutional principles and values, and so do their part to contribute to the maintenance of and promotion of an environment in which the rule of law may flourish. So the Supreme Court pointed out that no one can predict, obviously in politics, the course of secession negotiations might take. And they pointed out that the possibility that they might not lead to an agreement against the parties must be recognized. The negotiations following a referendum vote in favor of seeking secession would inevitably address a wide range of issues men of great import. So after so many years of the Confederation, in the case of Canada, there existed inevitably a high level of integration in the economic, the political, and the social institutions across Canada. The Supreme Court noted that federalism vision creates a unified country, not a loose alliance of autonomous provinces or states, federal states. So accordingly, while there are regional economic interests which sometimes coincide with the provincial boundaries, there are also national interests and enterprises, both public and private, that would face potential dismemberment when a secession takes place, because there is a national economy and a national debt, for example, shared by all the units in the federation. Hence the importance of negotiation to secede. Other arguments raised included the boundary issues, of course. Secession will change the boundaries of the country. For example, there are also linguistic and cultural minorities, including Aboriginal peoples, unevenly distributed across the country, who look to the Constitution of Canada for the protection of their rights. For the minorities, secession could give rise to many issues of great complexity and difficulty. These could have to be resolved within the overall framework of the rule of law, thereby assuring Canadians, all Canadians resident in Quebec and elsewhere, a measure of stability in what would likely be a period of considerable upheaval and uncertainty. During this process of secession, it was obvious that national existence, which appear to be seamless in many respects, would be effortlessly separated along what are now the provincial boundaries of Quebec. So the Supreme Court quoted the Attorney General of Saskatchewan in his oral submission during the hearing of this case, and that Attorney General said that a nation is built when communities that comprise it make commitments to it, when they forgo choices and opportunities on behalf of a nation, when the communities that comprise it make compromises, when they offer each other guarantees, when they make transfers, would pointedly, when they receive others the benefits of national solidarity. The threads of a thousand acts of accommodation, the Attorney General of Saskatchewan said, are the fabric of a nation. So you can see a picture painted by the Attorney General of Saskatchewan that a nation is a complex organism, and creating one takes time and effort and cooperation on part of those who constitute that nation. So secession cannot be taken lightly. So negotiations following a referendum would be difficult because the negotiators would have to contemplate the possibility of secession. There would be no absolute legal entitlement to it, and no assumption that an agreement reconciling all relevant rights and obligations would actually be reached. It is foreseeable, too, that even in negotiations carried out in conformity with the underlying constitutional principles would reach an impasse. The Supreme Court did not speculate as to what would then transpire at that point. Under the Constitution, secession requires that an amendment to the Constitution be negotiated. The respective rules of the courts and the political actors in the discharging the constitutional obligations in a secession dispute requires the distinction between the law of the Constitution, which generally speaking will be enforced by the courts, and other constitutional rules, such as the conventions of the Constitution, which carry only political sanctions. The judicial intervention, even in the relation to the law of the Constitution, is subject to the court's appreciation and its proper role in the constitutional scheme. The notion of justiciability is, for example, linked to the notion of appropriate judicial restraint. Justiciability means that the court has a reason to make a decision on the issues presented to it. So the Supreme Court referred to the discussion of justiciability, which it had already rendered in another case before, and said that in exercising its discretion whether to determine a matter that is alleged to be non-justiciable, the court's primary concern is to retain its proper role within the constitutional framework of our democratic form of government. Now, why is this important? This is important because in constitutional litigation, there are issues which are called non-justiciable, and the reason for that is if they are political issues. A democracy tries to draw a clear line between political issues, which may be decided by the political process, and justiciable issues, which can be resolved by the courts of law. The rule of law and constitutionalism requires those distinctions. In Operation Dismantle, that was another case which the Canadian Supreme Court decided. It was pointed out that justiciability is a doctrine founded upon a concern with the appropriate role of the courts as the forum for resolution of different types of disputes. An analogous doctrine of judicial restraint operates in this particular case. Also, as the court also made another decision where the Supreme Court that is, where it specifically said that there is an array of issues which calls for the exercise of judicial judgment on whether the questions are properly cognizable by the courts. Ultimately, such judgment depends on the appreciation by the judiciary of its own position in the constitutional scheme. So that's why I pointed out at the beginning of this conversation that this decision teaches us a lot about federalism and democracy. Democracy, we pointed out the four principles are very, very important. And therefore, that's what the court is trying to elaborate in its decision. The role of the court was limited to the identification of the relevant aspects of the Constitution in their broadest sense. The Supreme Court interpreted the questions as relating to the constitutional framework within which political decisions may ultimately be made. Within that framework, the workings of the political process are complex and can be resolved by the means of political judgment and evaluation. The court has no supervisory role over the political aspects of the constitutional negotiations. Equally, the Supreme Court pointed out the initial impetus for negotiation, namely a clear majority on a clear question in favor of secession, is subject only to political evaluation, and properly so, but not the courts. A right and a corresponding duty to negotiate secession cannot be built on an alleged expression of democratic will if the expression of democratic will is itself fraught with ambiguities. Only the political actors would have the information and the expertise to make the appropriate judgment as to the point at which the circumstances in which those ambiguities are resolved one way or the other. So here we are immersing ourselves deep into the waters of constitutional jurisprudence, and I hope that you will be patient and listen carefully, because sometimes these legal arguments can be abstract and obscure and opaque, but eventually we will explain them and try to illustrate what they mean. If the circumstances give rise to the duty to negotiate were to arise, the distinction the court pointed out between the strong defense of legitimate interest and the taking of positions which in fact ignore the legitimate interest of others is one that also defies legal analysis. The court could not have access to all of the information available to the political actors, and the methods appropriate for the search for the truth in a court of law are ill-suited to getting to the bottom of constitutional negotiations. To the extent, however, that the questions are political in nature, it is not the role of the judiciary to interpose its own views on the different negotiation positions of the parties, even where the court was invited to do so. Rather, it is the obligation of the elected representatives to give concrete form to the discharge of their constitutional obligations, which only they and their electors, the people, can ultimately assess. So the reconciliation of the various legitimate constitutional interests outlined in this judgment is necessarily committed to the political rather than the judicial realm, precisely because that reconciliation can only be achieved through the give and take of the negotiation process. Having established the legal framework, it would be for the democratically elected leadership of the various participants to resolve their differences. The non-justiciability of political issues that lack a legal component does not deprive the surrounding constitutional framework of its binding status. This means that the constitutional obligations could be breached without incurring several legal repercussions. Where there are legal rights, there are or should be remedies. The appropriate recourse in some circumstances lie through the workings of the political process rather than the courts. I'm going into details here because it is important. It is in the nature of democracy itself. Democracy, as some say, is a messy process that since we need it, we have to be prepared to go through that mess to achieve the results we want. So to the extent that a breach of the constitutional duty to negotiate in accordance with the principles described in this judgment of the Supreme Court of Kenya, of Canada, not Kenya, undermines the legitimacy of a party's actions, it may have important ramifications at the international level. Thus, a failure of the duty to undertake the negotiations and pursue them according to constitutional principles may undermine the government's claim to legitimacy, which is generally a precondition for recognition by the international community, should cessation, of course, succeed. Conversely, violations of those principles by the federal or other provincial governments responding to the request for cessation may undermine their legitimacy. Thus, a Quebec that had negotiated in conformity with the constitutional principles and values in the face of unreasonable intransigence on the part of other participants at the federal or provincial level would more likely to be recognized than a Quebec which did not itself act according to constitutional principles in the negotiation process. Both the legality of the acts of the parties to the negotiation process under Canadian law and the perceived legitimacy of such action would be important considerations in the recognition process of a new state that secedes. In this way, the adherence of the parties to the obligations to negotiate would be evaluated in an indirect manner on the international plane. Accordingly, the cessation of Quebec from Canada cannot be or could not be accomplished by National Assembly, the legislature, or the government of Quebec unilaterally. That was the ruling of the Supreme Court. That is to say, without principled negotiations and be considered a lawful act. Any attempt to effect the accession of a province from Canada must be undertaken pursuant to the Constitution of Canada, or else violate the Canadian legal order. However, the continued existence and the operation of Canadian constitutional order cannot remain unaffected by the unambiguous expression of a clear majority of Quebecers that they no longer wish to remain in Canada. The primary means by which that expression is given effect is the constitutional duty to negotiate in accordance with the constitutional principles. In the event cessation negotiations are initiated, the Constitution, no less than the history of the country, would call for the participants to work to reconcile the rights, obligations, and legitimate aspirations of all Canadians within a framework that emphasizes constitutional responsibilities as much as it does constitutional rights. Now, several issues arise from the arguments of the Canadian Supreme Court on the abortive Quebec secession. First, do arguments tailored to the duty to negotiate in a secession in a federal system of government apply to a unitary system as well? I'm asking you, the listeners. In particular, the case of Scotland in England comes to mind. Unlike Canada, UK is a unitary state. In other words, is there a difference when considering secession between the obligations to negotiate under a federal regime and under a unitary regime? I'm asking you, the listener, what is your answer? These are issues we have to face and therefore confront when designing new political systems. Second, since the arguments of the Canadian Supreme Court have implications on the legitimacy of secessionism under international law, especially when evaluating a political situation, whether or not to reconcile a newly created state under international law. Is the democratization process creating legal duties on states under international law to do or abstain from doing certain things or taking specific political actions? The decision of the Canadian Supreme Court does not help us to answer these questions. The logical consequences of the decision of the Canadian Supreme Court, however, seem to be that internal democratization of a state by itself inevitably creates international obligations as well. This has necessary implications on the political recognition of new states and international law. It also has obvious, serious implications for Kelsen's doctrine of effective control of the state after coup d'etat under international law automatically leading to recognition of the state and or a new regime. The Canadian Supreme Court took this issue, we will get to it later, and the principle they call the principle of effectivity. We will see what answer they try to provide. But third, the point to observe is the fact that the process of democratization is merging the two separate spheres of jurisprudence of constitutional law and the jurisprudence of international law. The reason for this is that the protection of human rights exists in the two spheres, both of constitutional law and international law. It is no longer possible, and in fact it does not make sense, to separate protection of human rights under the Constitution and under international law. It doesn't make sense to view these spheres as different and separate. Democratization, in my opinion, started within the domestic jurisdiction of the state. It has now expanded into the domain of international law. And I cite as my authority the Canadian decision on the secession of Quebec. It will be noted that question one, which in the Quebec secession case did not ask how secession could be achieved in a constitutional manner, but addressed one form of secession only, namely unilateral secession. Although the applicability of various procedures to achieve lawful secession was raised in the arguments, each option would require the Supreme Court of Canada to assume the existence of the facts that were unknown at the time of reference made by the Governor General to the Supreme Court of Canada. In accordance with the usual rule of prudence in constitutional cases, the Supreme Court refrained from announcing on the applicability of any particular constitutional procedure to effect secession unless and until sufficiently clear facts exist to squarely raise an issue for judicial determination. Now, we go to this is how the Supreme Court of Canada treated what they called the principle of effectivity. For those who listened to my earlier conversations, I referred to, when discussing obstacles to democratization and coup d'etats as being serious obstacles, what the Supreme Court here is calling effectivity principle is what we called the Kelsen's principle of effectiveness, effective control of the territory. The Canadian Supreme Court did not think that the principle of effectivity had any application to the issues raised by question one. That is whether or not Quebec could secede. A distinction must be drawn between the right of a people to act and their power to do so. They are not identical. These two concepts. A right is recognized in the law. Mere physical ability is not necessarily given the status of a right. The fact that an individual or group can act in a certain way says nothing at all about the legal status or consequences of the act itself. A power may be exercised even in the absence of a right to do so. But if it is, then it is exercised without legal foundation. No constitution addresses powers in that sense. The Constitution is concerned with the rights and obligations of individual groups and governments and the structure of institutions. It was suggested, for example, in the case of before the Supreme Court of Canada, that the National Assembly, the legislature, and the government of Quebec could unilaterally effect the secession of that province from Canada. But it was not suggested that they might do so as a matter of law. Rather, it was contended that they simply could do so as a matter of fact. Although under the Constitution there is no right to pursue secession unilaterally, that is secession without principled negotiations or democratic process. This does not rule out the possibility of an unconstitutional declaration of secession leading to a de facto secession. The ultimate success of such a secession would be dependent on effective control of a territory and recognition by the international community that a new state or international personality has been created. The Canadian Supreme Court concluded that the alleged principle of effectivity has no constitutional or legal status, in the sense that it does not provide an ex ante explanation or justification for that act. In essence, acceptance of a principle of effectivity would be tantamount to accepting that the National Assembly, legislature, or government of Quebec may act without regard to the law, simply because it asserts the power to do so. So, viewed, the suggestion is that the National Assembly, legislature, or government of Quebec could purport to secede the province unilaterally from Canada in disregard of Canadian and international law. It is further suggested that if the secession was not successful, for example, a new legal order would be created in that province, which would then be considered an independent state. So, such a proposition, according to the Supreme Court, is an assertion of fact, not a statement of law. It may or may not be true. In any event, it is irrelevant to the question of law. If, on the other hand, it is put forward as an assertion of law, then it simply amounts to the contention that the law may be broken as long as it can be broken successfully. Such a notion is contrary to the rule of law and must be rejected. The Supreme Court of Canada ruled. Now, we come to question 2. Question 2 is probably more interesting than question 1, depending on your interests, of course. The question was, does international law give the National Assembly, the legislature, or the government of Quebec the right to effect the cessation of Quebec from Canada unilaterally. In this regard, is there a right to self-determination and international law? That would give the National Assembly, legislature, or government, or Quebec, the right to effect the cessation of Quebec from Canada unilaterally. I say this is an interesting question because I'm sure there are many people in Uganda whose hands are itching. They probably think the best solution to fight dictatorship is to secede. Well, let us see what the law is. The court did not accept the contention that question 2 raised a question of pure international law which the Supreme Court of Canada had no jurisdiction to address. Question 2 was posed in the context of a reference to address the existence or non-existence of a right of unilateral cessation by a province of Canada. The amicus curiae, was the person who was appointed by the court, the Supreme Court of Canada, to represent Quebec's interests. Why was this? Because the officials of Quebec refused to participate in this process. Well, that was their politics. But anyway, the Supreme Court, wanting to be fair, they appointed somebody from Quebec to represent Quebec's interests, and that's in legal language, you can call it Latin, amicus curiae, argued that the question ultimately had to be determined under international law. In addressing this issue, the court did not purport to act as an arbiter between sovereign states or more generally within the international community. The court was engaged in rendering an advisory opinion on certain legal aspects of the continued existence of Canadian Federation. International law has not been invoked as a consideration and had therefore to be addressed. The argument before the court on question 2 focused largely on the determining whether under international law a positive legal right to unilateral cessation exists in the factual circumstances assumed for the purpose of the response to question 1. Arguments were also advanced to the effect that regardless of the existence or non-existence of a positive right to unilateral cessation, international law will in the end recognize effective political realities, including the emergence of a new state as a fact. While the Supreme Court's response to question 2 addressed the considerations raised by the alternative argument of effectivity, it would first be noted that the existence of a positive legal entitlement is quite different from a prediction that the law will respond upon after the fact to a then existing political reality. These two concepts examine different points in time. The questions posed to the court address legal rights in advance of the Unilateral Act of purported dissertation, while the Supreme Court touched on the practice of governing the international recognition of emerging states. The court was very wary of entertaining speculation about the possible future or conduct of sovereign states on the international level. It was a question one to speculate about the possible future course of political negotiation among the participants in the Canadian Federation. In both cases, the reference questions are directed only to the legal framework within which the political actors their various mandates. Now, the constitutional, the Supreme Court did address this issue directly, but we've completed the first hour of this conversation, and I will request a short break or interval, and then when I come back, I will address the issue of secession at international law. Thank you very much.
You are listening to the Voice of Uganda Radio, the mouthpiece of all Ugandans, wherever they may be, to voice their problems without fear of any retribution. The Voice of Uganda Radio works in sync with FADU, the Federalist Alliance of Democracy and Development in Uganda. FADU is an organization that was formed to work as a platform for all Ugandans, at home and outside, to work synergistically to liberate our mother Uganda from the ruthless invaders that have sucked it dry. Therefore, FADU invites all able Ugandans to act now and save the Ugandan humanity that is being slaughtered, destroyed, and robbed by a few people unworthy to call themselves Ugandan. Many people are crying for action in Uganda as they languish in misery. FADU echoes this cry by making the loudest alarm to everyone to join FADU, not tomorrow or the next day, but today. The number to join is 408-904-77038. The email is info@fadu.org.
Wherever you may be, inside of the walls of Uganda or in the community of exile, like unwanted children from the country that gave you birth, living amongst the free world. Rise up, my fellow Ugandans, as we fight against the dictatorship of the oppression of Musoke, for the rights of teachers, for the rights of government, for the rights of the justice system, trying to fight for the rights and the belief of the Ugandan people. Musoke has made a promise to Parliament of 150 million shillings to right the wrongs and to help them to make their lives whole again. Buying votes, buying the rights to rule the people for another 5 years in a dictatorship that has just destroyed Uganda to almost an unrecognizable state. What about the promises to the rest of the people that he's made? When will he make true on those things? Or do they not matter because they don't have a vote to keep him into office? I tell you, my fellow Ugandans, there's nothing free and fair about the election that's coming up when a sitting president can offer these type of monies and funds to a group of people to make sure that he holds his powerful position. Members of Parliament, it can happen to you. The same promises he made to the teachers who have gone without salary, some of them for 2 months. The same promises that he's made to other leaders and others who've tried to rule and stand up against him. only to fall by the hands of death, by torture, by house arrest, by whatever means he feels the need needs to be to keep them in control. We live in a time, my fellow Ugandans, where one man, one family, and one group feels the need to speak for all. Where land grabbing has gone on so much that they own pretty much all of the country. Which daily they sell pieces of the country off to the highest bidder to continue to keep money in this man's hand, to fund his wars, to fund his battles, to bribe the community, to keep himself in power in whatever way he can, leaving the Ugandan people with such a debt that they will wake up one day and Uganda will no longer belong to the people, but will be bought and sold off in bits and pieces to the highest bidder, wherever the money and wherever the funds need to come to keep this man in power. For the truth and the justice, for the helpless, we stand and we fight on behalf of the Ugandan people to bring back wholeness and completeness back to the Ugandan people. This is not a battle of arms, but a battle of spirit, a battle of souls and of the mind of the people of Uganda. The public management bill was put in place to keep us quiet. We must rise, we must stand together, we must find strength in one another to move forward on behalf of our beloved Uganda. It is a country that our fathers, our grandfathers, our mothers and our grandmothers fought and worked the land to make it a place in which we could live and have a life and take care of our families. Too many Ugandans are living in exile, in communities out in the free world, like unwanted children from the country that gave them birth. It's time for us to stand hand in hand and enter back into the country and take it back to make it great for all Ugandans, especially the youth of the country, who have an 80% unemployment rate. Time and time again, companies have tried to go into Uganda to work with the Ugandan government, but corruption has fallen at the hands of the Ugandan people time and time again. It takes from the mouth of the hungry. There is no medicine. The hospitals are falling apart. The roads are undrivable. The country has become unrecognizable at the hands of one man who sells the country off piece by piece, bit by bit to the highest bidder to continue to bid his war, to continue to fund the people who will vote him in and keep him in a position of power over all. The day has come, my fellow Ugandans. We must stand up. We must unite.
After a short break, short interval, I'm back to continue the conversation. And as I pointed out before the break, the issues we are going to discuss now have deal with the secession under international law. Before that, we were discussing secession under the constitutional law. So these two spheres of law should be distinctive and should be understood as separate and different. But as I pointed out earlier also, these two previously distinctive spheres of law are merging due to democratization. Democratization has an impact which is inevitably merging constitutional law and international law into one body of laws as far as human rights are concerned. It is clear that international law does not specifically grant component parts of sovereign states the legal right to secede unilaterally from their parent state. This was acknowledged by the experts who testified in the case before the Canadian Supreme Court, and on behalf both of the amicus curiae that is the person representing the legal interests of Quebec, and the Attorney General of Canada. Given the lack of specific authorization for unilateral cessation, proponents of the existence of such a right at international law are therefore left to attempt to found their arguments first on the proposition that unilateral cessation is not specifically prohibited, and that what is not specifically prohibited under the law is by inference permitted. And second, on the implied duty of states to recognize the legitimacy of the cessation brought about by the exercise of the well-established international law right of a people to self-determination. The amicus curiae addressed the right of self-determination, but submitted that it was not applicable to the circumstances of Quebec within the Canadian Federation, irrespective of the existence of non-existence of the referendum result in favor of secession. So the Supreme Court agreed on this point with the amicus curiae for reasons which will be given soon. So the issue of the absence of a specific prohibition, implying that there is a right. The Supreme Court argued that international law contains neither a right of unilateral cessation nor the explicit denial of such a right, although such a denial is to some extent implicit in the exceptional circumstances required for the cessation to be permitted under the right of a people to self-determination. That is, the right of cessation that arises in the exceptional situation of an oppressed or colonial people discussed below. As will be seen, international law places great importance on the territorial integrity of a nation state, and by and large leaves the creation of a new state to be determined by the domestic law of the existing state of which the seceding entity presently forms a part. Where, as here in this case of the Canadian case, unilateral cessation would be incompatible with the domestic constitution, international law is likely to accept that the conclusion subject to the right of the people to self-determination did not exist. So the right of a people, what does the right of people to self-determination mean? While international law generally regulates the conduct of nation states, it does not. It does, in some specific circumstances, also recognize the rights of entities other than the nation state, such as the right of a people to self-determination, and the existence of the right of a people to self-determination is now so widely recognized in international conventions that the principle has acquired a status beyond convention and is considered a general principle of international law at this stage. Article 1 of the Charter of the United Nations provides that states in part that one of the purposes of the United Nations is to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. So, again, the UN Charter, Article 55 of the UN Charter, further states that the UN shall promote goals such as higher standards of living, full employment, and human rights, with a view to the creation of conditions of stability and well-being which are necessary for peaceful and friendly relations among the nations based on the respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. This basic right of self-determination has been carried forward and addressed in so many UN conventions and resolutions that authorities believe that the sheer number of resolutions concerning the right to self-determination makes their enumeration impossible. So probably that implies that the right is implicit or recognized. For the Canadian Supreme Court purposes, the reference to the following the conventions and the resolutions was sufficient. So the recognized Article 1 of the UN Charter and the Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Article 1 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which states that all peoples have the right of self-determination by virtue of the right they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. So, similarly, the UN General Assembly's Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning the friendly relations and cooperation among the states in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations provides that by virtue of the principles of equal rights and self-determination of peoples enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, all peoples have the right to freely to determine without external interference their political status and to pursue their economic, social, cultural development, and every state has the duty to respect this right in accordance with the provisions of the Charter. What these international instruments and the resolutions are really saying, they are emphasizing our point of democratization within the state. Once democratization takes effect, all these rights are human rights, which should be recognized by the government, which is not, of course, dictatorial. The United Nations General Assembly Declaration on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the United Nations also emphasizes a right of self-determination by providing that the United Nations member states will, quote, continue to reaffirm the right of self-determination of all peoples, taking into account the particular situation of peoples under colonial or other forms of alien domination or foreign occupation, and recognize the right of peoples to take legitimate action in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations to realize their inalienable right of self-determination. This shall not be construed as authorizing or encouraging any action that would dismember or impair totally or in part, the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states conducting themselves in compliance with the principle of equal rights and self-determination of the peoples, and thus possessed of a government representing the people, the whole people belonging to the territory without distinction of any kind. Implicit, of course, in that statement is that there is no problem if democracy exists within this state. The right of self-determination is also recognized in other international legal documents. For example, the final act of the Conference on the Security and Cooperation of Europe, sometimes referred to as the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, provides the participating states will respect the equal rights of the peoples and their right to self-determination, acting at all times in conformity with the purposes and the principles of the Charter of the United Nations and with the relevant norms of international law, including those relating to territorial integrity of states. By virtue of the principle of equal rights and the self-determination of peoples, all peoples always have the right in full freedom to determine when and as they wish their internal and external political status without external interference, and to pursue as they wish their political, economic, social, and cultural development. So, it is clear that this right to self-determination of peoples has been addressed by the Charter of UN, the international covenants, and other international forums. As we shall see, international law expects that the right of self-determination will be exercised by the people within the framework of existing sovereign states and consistently with the maintenance of the territorial integrity of these states. Where this is not possible, in exceptional circumstances, a right of secession may arise. But first of all, what does the peoples mean? International law grants the right to self-determination to peoples. Excuse me. Accordingly, access to the right requires the threshold step of characterizing as a people the group seeking self-determination. However, as the right to self-determination has developed by virtue of a combination of international agreements and conventions, coupled with state practice within it, with little formal elaboration of the definition of peoples, the result has been that the precise meaning of the term peoples remains somewhat uncertain. It is clear that a people may include only a portion of the population of an existing state. The right to self-determination has developed largely in a human right and is generally used in documents that simultaneously contain references to nation or state. The juxtaposition of these terms is indicative that the inference of people does not necessarily mean the entirety of a state's population. To restrict the definition of the term to the population of the existing state would render the granting of a right to self-determination largely duplicative, given the parallel emphasis within the majority of the source of documents in the need to protect the territorial integrity of existing states, and would frustrate its remedial purpose. So, the Canadian Supreme Court was saying that while much of the Quebec population certainly shares many of the characteristics, such as common language and culture, that would be considered in determining whether a specific group is a people, as do the groups within Quebec and or Canada. It is not necessary to explore this legal characterization to resolve question 2 appropriately. Similarly, it is not necessary for the court to determine whether should a Quebec people exist within the definition of public international law. Such a people encompasses the entirety of the provincial population or just a portion thereof. Nor is it necessary, the court continued, to examine the position of the Aboriginal population within Quebec, as the following discussion of the scope of the right of self-determination will make clear whatever be the correct application of the definition of peoples in this context. Their right of self-determination cannot in the present circumstance be said to ground the right to unilateral secession. The definition of peoples in a federal unit poses problems. This issue is also important. I must point out in Mukasa's concept of identifying indigenous peoples and their rights to the ownership of land and a post-colonial state. And I must point out also one of our callers, Mr. Galabuzi's thesis, more aligned to imperialism, would pose different issues. We shall deal with these issues later separately from a theoretical perspective, and they should not be confused with what the Canadian Supreme Court was deciding. So the recognized sources of international law establish that the right to self-determination of a people is normally fulfilled through internal self-determination, a people's pursuit of its political, economic, social, and cultural development within the framework of an existing state. A right to external self-determination, which in this case potentially takes the form of the assertion of a right to unilateral secession, case of Quebec, arises in only the most extreme of cases, and even then, under carefully defined circumstances, external self-determination can be defined as in the following statement from the Declaration of Friendly Relations as the establishment of the foreign and independent state, the free association of or the integration with an independent state, or the emergence into any other political status freely determined by a people constitutes modes of implementing a right to self-determination by that people. The international law principle of self-determination has evolved within a framework of respect for the territorial integrity of existing states. The various international the documents which we've quoted that support the existence of a people's right to self-determination also contain parallel statements supportive of the conclusion that the exercise of such a right must be sufficiently limited to prevent threats to an existing state's territorial integrity or stability of relation between several states. So, the Declaration of on Friendly Relations, or the Vienna Declaration, and the Declaration of the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the United Nations, we've quoted their specific. They state immediately after affirming the people's right to determine political, economic, social, and cultural issues, that such rights are not to be construed as authorizing or encouraging an action that would dismember or impair totally or in part the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states conducting themselves in accordance with the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and thus the possessed of a government representing the whole people belonging to the territory without a distinction. So, implicit in that is the fact that democratization actually preempts the right of a people to secede, if you get my point. Similarly, while the concluding document of the Vienna meeting, for example, in 1989 of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe on the follow-up of the Helsinki Act, again it refers to peoples having the right to determine their internal and external political status. That statement is immediately followed by the express recognition that the participating states will at all times act as stated in the Helsinki Act in conformity with the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and the relevant forms of international law, including those relating to territorial integrity of states. So, where do we go from here? The reference in the Helsinki Final Act to people determining its external political status is interpreted to mean the expression of the people's external political status through the government of the existing state, save in the exceptional circumstances where there is a dictatorship. As given the history and the textual structure of this that document, the Helsinki Final Act, its reference to the external self-determination simply means to no territorial or other change can be brought about by the central authorities of a state that is that extinguishes all these fires for self-determination. Why would you seek self-determination if you are comfortable where you are and if your rights are protected? But on the contrary, when your rights are trampled upon, are threatened all the time, are denied all the time, you have a right to say goodbye. I'm not here anymore. I'm gone. I'm seceding. Now, what about colonial and oppressed peoples? Accordingly, the general state of international law with respect to the right to self-determination is that the right operates within the overriding protection granted to the territorial integrity of parent states. However, there are certainly defined contexts within which the right to self-determination of people does not allow, where it allows, actually, that right to be exercised externally, which in the context of the Canadian case would potentially mean secession. The right to external self-determination, which entails the possibility of choosing or restoring independence, has only been bestowed upon two classes of peoples: those under colonial rule or foreign occupation. Sudanese, South Sudan, listen. Foreign occupation gives you a right to self-determination based upon the assumptions that both classes make up entities that are inherently distinct from the colonial power and the occupant power, and that their territorial integrity, all that destroyed by the colonialist or occupying power, should be fully restored. South Sudanese, listen carefully. Your right to self-determination may be being violated by Museveni's forces. The right of colonial peoples to exercise their right to self-determination by breaking away from the imperial power is now undisputed, but was irrelevant to the Canadian case. So the other clear case where the right to external self-determination accrues is where the people is subject to alien subjugation, domination, or exploitation outside the colonial context. This recognition finds its roots in the Declaration on Friendly Relations, which provides that every state has the duty to promote, through joint and separate action, realization of the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples in accordance with the provisions of the Charter, and to render assistance to the United Nations in carrying out the responsibilities entrusted to it by the Charter regarding implementation of the principle, in order first to promote friendly relations and cooperation among states, and two, to bring a speedy end to colonialism, having due regard to freely expressed will of the peoples concerned. So, and a number of commentators have further asserted that the right to self-determination may be grounded, a right to the unilateral cessation in a third circumstances. Although this third circumstance has been described in several ways, the underlying proposition is that when a people is blocked from the meaningful exercise of its right to self-determination internally, it is entitled, as a last resort, to exercise it by secession. The Vienna Declaration requirement that governments represent the war people belonging to territorial to the territory without distinction of any kind also adds credence to the assertion that such a complete blockage may potentially give rise to a right of secession. So I think my listeners can follow this argument. The democratization is important. Once it takes place, as I pointed out earlier, it extinguishes these fires that started to secede from the territory. And the Canadian case is a very good example. That's why we decided to look at it in greater detail. So in case of Canada, the population, the court ruled that the population of Quebec cannot plausibly be said to be denied access to government. Quebecers occupy prominent positions within the government of Canada. Residents of the province freely make political choices and pursue economic, social, and cultural development within Quebec, across Canada, and throughout the world. The populations of Quebec, the population of Quebec is equitably represented in the legislature, in the executive, and the judicial institutions. In short, to reflect the phraseology of the international documents that address the right to self-determination of peoples, Canada is a sovereign and independent state conducting itself in compliance with the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and thus possessed of a government representing the whole people belonging to the territory without a distinction. The continuing failure to reach agreement on the amendments to the Constitution, while a matter of concern, does not amount to a denial of self-determination. In the absence of the amendments to the Canadian Constitution, the Supreme Court must look at the constitutional arrangements presently in effect, and the Supreme Court cannot conclude under current circumstances that those arrangements place Quebecers in a disadvantaged position within the scope of the international law rule. In summary, the international law right to self-determination only generates, at best, a right to external self-determination in situations of former colonies where a people is oppressed, as for example under foreign military occupation, or where the definable group is denied meaningful access to government to pursue their political, their economic, their social, and cultural development. In all three situations, the people in question are entitled to a right to external self-determination because they have been denied the ability to exert internally, that is, within their state, their right to self-determination. Such exceptional circumstances are manifested. They are manifestly, the Canadian court ruled, they are inapplicable to Quebec under existing conditions. Accordingly, neither the population of the province of Quebec, even if characterized in terms of people or peoples, nor its representative institutions, the National Assembly, the legislature, or the government of Quebec, possess a right under international law to secede unilaterally from Canada. That was the ruling of the Supreme Court of Canada. So the Supreme Court acknowledged that it would not wish to leave an aspect of its answer to question 2 without acknowledging the importance of the submissions made, respecting the rights and concerns of Aboriginal peoples in the event of a unilateral cessation, as well as the appropriate means of defining the boundaries of a seceding Quebec within the particular regard to the northern lands occupied largely by Aboriginal peoples. However, the concern of the Aboriginal peoples is precipitated by the asserted right of Quebec to unilateral cessation. In light of the Supreme Court finding that there is no such right applicable to the population of Quebec, either under the Constitution of Canada or at international law, but that, on the contrary, a clear democratic expression of support for the cessation would lead to, under the Constitution, to negotiations in which the Aboriginal interests would be taken into account. It becomes unnecessary to explore the concerns of the Aboriginal peoples. So the court made that ruling. It also pointed out about the effectivity principle. As stated, an argument advanced by Amicus Curiae, the representative of Quebec in the Supreme Court case, on this branch, the reference was that while international law may not ground a positive right to unilateral cessation in the context of Quebec, international law equally does not prohibit cessation. In fact, international recognition would be conferred on such a political reality if it emerged, for example, via effective control of the territory of what is now the province of Quebec. It is true that international law may well, depending on the circumstances, adapt to recognize the political and or factual reality, regardless of the legality and the steps leading to the creation. However, as mentioned at the outset, the effectivity principle as such does not have any real applicability to question 2, and which asks whether a right to unilateral cessation exists. So no one doubts that legal consequences may flow from political clarity of a political fact.
Mr. Mubilu,
Yes.
you have a call?
Okay.
Hello, Mr. Mubilu, good morning.
Good morning, sir. How are you doing?
My name is Tumakula,
Yes.
and I'm calling. I'm a bit lost. Under what circumstances are people allowed to secede?
Under what circumstances?
Yeah, supposing that we are not under colonialism, that we are an independent country.
Yeah. Okay.
Under what circumstances does international law recognize a community's right to secede or need to secede?
Okay. I think I get your question.
Okay.
I think it is an important question, and I think it deserves a full answer. Well, the circumstances are clear. The absence, for example, of democracy, when a regime is brutal and it discriminates, for example, mistreats certain members of the community, those people whose rights are denied or who are mistreated, those are sufficient circumstances for international law, and for that matter, even domestic law, to recognize the fact that they have a right to secede. Probably the best and the most recent example is South Sudan. As you know, in Sudan, as it was before, the regime in Khartoum was Islamic and was imposing Islamic law on the southern Christian population, that they should conform to Islamic norms, and they were punished and they were required to conform to these religious norms, of which they did not subscribe, they did not believe in. They had a right under international law to have their own religions and to be free from the rules of Sharia as imposed by the Sudanese government. So you can see they took up the guns and started the fighting. And eventually an agreement was reached in Nairobi, and according to the agreement, there was going to be a referendum, and in the referendum, whatever the results were going to be, would be binding. And of course, as you know, they did vote, and they decided to secede. This situation is very similar to the Canadian Quebec. What was the difference between Sudan and Quebec? In Quebec, they never took up the guns. They wanted to use the ballot box. However, as I've just pointed out a few moments before you called, in the case of Quebec, they could not establish as a fact that the Quebecans, whether the French-speaking or the Aboriginal, that they have been discriminated against. In fact, the court pointed out that the Quebecans had, in fact, produced more prime ministers in Canada than the other regions, than the other provinces. So they had not been discriminated against. They have been included in the process, unlike South Sudan. So, under what circumstances, you ask, does international law recognize a right to secede? South Sudan is my best authority for you, sir. So I don't know whether you are satisfied with my answer.
So if minority rights are not exercised or allowed to be exercised, then secession is a safety valve.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
That can be enacted or exercised.
Yeah. That's why I'm linking the conversation to two aspects. First, to federalism, and second, to democratization. And as I've pointed out, only mad people whose rights are protected and enjoyed under a democratic regime would demand cessation, if you understand what I'm talking about. It takes mistreatment and the denial of your rights to want to secede, to divorce yourself from the state.
From the bigger unit.
Yeah.
So
what
if
the Canadians...
no denial of my rights, then... Okay.
Excuse me?
Yeah. So if my rights are not denied, exercise of my rights is not denied, then I don't have grounds for secession. Is that the issue?
You have absolutely answered the question.
Okay.
In exactly
All
the
right.
same way I would have answered it myself.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. I'll give up so that you may continue. Thank you very much.
You are welcome, Mr. Semakula, also known as the James, I believe. We are coming to the close of this conversation. I wasn't able to go through all the arguments of the Supreme Court, but I think the essence of the argument has already been made, and the thesis which has been brought out by Mr. Semakula's question has already been explained, that this right to self-determination or even to secede is grounded in the denial of your rights. It does not exist, and the two cases I've cited, the Canadian case we are dealing with, and the Sudanese case we have already witnessed, are clear cases to prove that when there is a denial of rights, human rights, then a right arises to either secede or to divorce yourself from the state, whether it is a federal state. And I pose the question whether the Canadian ruling actually also applies to non-federal states. Obviously, the Sudanese case, the Sudan was a unitary state. It was not a federal state. But it did not conform to the procedures laid down by the Supreme Court of Canada that you have to negotiate. The negotiation in the case of Sudan depended mainly on the power of the gun. The Southern Sudanese picked up the guns and aimed them at the Northerners until the Northerners agreed to negotiate, and the Canadian case also emphasizes negotiation. So the agreement in the case of Sudan, the Nairobi Agreement produced the referendum and allowed the secession of Southern Sudan peacefully through a referendum, although the conditions for that peaceful resolution was grounded in a military conflict for which the Northern Sudanese could not win. We will stop here, but next week I think I'll make a summation of this Canadian case, because it's very, very important, as I pointed out. Especially I want to emphasize the democratization process, how it is related to this process, because as I pointed out earlier, the democratization acts like a fire extinguisher for secessionism. It prevents it from taking place because it ensures the protection of human rights. And we will look more closely about the Aboriginals. There is no state that has a one homogeneous population, so except Japan. But even in Japan, they still have their local northern differences, southern differences, and so on and so on. So what in the Canadian decision did was followed by what the enactment of the Clarity Act. The Clarity Act recognizes the judgment of the Supreme Court by endorsing and acknowledging the different rulings of this and on the procedures required to ensure a clear formulation of a referendum by involving the legislatures of the seceding province and the national legislatures and the political parties, and then negotiating the terms of secession if it is to be valid under both the Constitution and international law. So we will stop here, and I will also give you a hint about future conversations just to provoke your interest, if I may say, stimulate your interests. After Canada, we will deal with Australia, very, very similar to, but also very different from Canada. However, they both have British ancestry, and they have different local problems to deal with. So we will see. Probably next week we'll be able to go to start a conversation on Australia, which is very unique also. So without much ado, I want to bid you farewell, hoping that next week you will tune in on this democratization of Africa, the case of Uganda in a comparative perspective.